Welcome to this session of this annual meeting of the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies. We had a very nice day yesterday with good discussions, both on the more philosophical sides of humanitarian action and then on the diplomatic and legal sides of this. We heard about the tensions between humanitarian action and counterterrorism, and how the war on terror as a framework or an aspect of international politics have formed political dynamics, but also then humanitarian action in over the past 20 years, how that has had extensive consequences also at the local political levels in the Middle East, amongst other regions. And today, in today's panel, we will hear from some Norway-based organizations and also from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, some experiences from this field. So we've invited a few representatives of these organizations. More organizations could have been here, so it's a sort of sample of the landscape. But we're very proud to have Trude Falk from Norwegian People's Aid, Ida Haugen-Poljak from Norwegian Red Cross, Linda Bukkåsen online from Save the Children Norway, Trygve Thorsson from Doctors Without Borders, MSF, and Carl Salikath from Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I wanted to start this a bit informally by asking you and putting you a bit on the spot, because I didn't prepare you for this, to just say a few words about yourself and how you personally have related to this topic in your work. So this also includes what your current role is, but I guess that you've probably had several roles throughout your career. You don't have to go through all of that, but what you can think of that relates most directly to today's topic on consequences of the global war on terror for Norwegian humanitarian efforts. So I'd like to start then in the same direction with Trude, then Ida, Linda, Trygve, and Carl. So Trude, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Putting us a bit on the spot, I think, to say kind of the personal story about how got engaged, and I just have to admit that I've got a bit nerdish on this. And the reason is that we really feel the challenges. I'm the head of section for Middle East North Africa in Norwegian People's Aid. NPA is an organization which is not only humanitarian, we also work in mine action, and we have an extensive engagement in development programs, support to civil society, democratization. So we are really one of those really multi-mandated organizations, so that we will work over a kind of broad spectrum. We have, as an organization, faced extensive challenges, I would say, in regard to the unintended consequences of the war on terror, more than the kind of the intended ones, more than kind of the operational challenges on the ground in how to operate in high-risk areas where you have different kinds of stakeholders who would be designated, not designated. It's less of a challenge, I think, for us than all the unintended consequences.
Sorry for interrupting, but this was to be just on you personally.
Okay. Yeah, but and that's why I got nerdish.
We come back to your yeah. To the organization afterwards.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, sorry.
No problem. So just a little about your own role and your own
Now being then the head of the section, of course we are facing this on day-to-day basis. I mean, this is all about how to get our work done, and not least how to get our money through, because that's increasing challenge, and we are also facing a lot of attacks because of the way that what I would call lawfare, when the laws on anti-terror are used by political actors to attack those actors who are then seen as representing opponents to them. So I think from day-to-day basis, we are spending a lot of time on this. I mean, I've been spending up to half of my time on this over a period, because this has become such a challenge to us. And we see that we just need to to put up the resources that we might have. So I think that's my reason for becoming nerdy on the issue.
Yeah, and you'll get plenty of chance to for that afterwards. So Ida, just on your current work, but also how you've related to this topic.
Yeah. So my name is Ida, and I work as a senior advisor on the Middle East and North Africa in a unit called Humanitarian Needs and Analysis for the Norwegian Red Cross. And I think that this topic, in a sense, kind of is a red thread in my last 10 years, starting from my master thesis, actually, where I wrote on engaging non-state armed groups to increase compliance with international humanitarian law. And I think that, I mean, one of the arguments that I will kind of put forth in this session today is that engaging and being able to talk to and engage and train and non-state armed groups on issues such as international humanitarian law is essential to increase respect for humanitarian norms. Also, I've worked for the Norwegian Red Cross with a project called Healthcare in Danger, which is about the attacks and security for humanitarian workers and healthcare workers in specific. And I think this also relates to kind of this narrative that has built up through the war on terror that providing assistance to the so-called enemy is not allowed. I've also worked on donor relations, where this, of course, frequently comes up. And now in the working on the Middle East, this is a very pertinent topic because it affects a lot of our programs in MENA countries. Yeah.
Wonderful. Linda.
Yes. So, hi. So I'm the area director for Middle East and Eastern Europe with Save the Children Norway, which means I'm also head of section, similar to Trude. We do work both with long-term humanitarian and not long-term, but long-term and humanitarian funding. But I would say our portfolio is maybe 90% humanitarian in our region. So of course, a lot is related to what's happening in Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Lebanon in particular. Over the years, I would say, just like Ida, it's been a red thread for a long time, especially since we started working on the Syria file. Syria was a complete new country to Save the Children when we started working with it in 2011. We did not have any presence on the ground. We did not have any partners. And I think a lot of the initial experience, especially also in donor relations, was really around how we in a safe way, without taking too many risks, without crossing red lines, actually engage actively in Syria. I have had also a lot of discussions around duty of care and how we actually operate in this, because we see that the counterterrorism legislation, just like Trude says, has so many implications beyond the compliance side. I also work for an organization where compliance is high on the agenda. So just, really working to demonstrate the effects on civil society, for instance, like the shrinking space that we see in Palestine, has been an important part of my work over the years. I've also had the chance to do the humanitarian leadership program recently, and did, like Ida, spend quite some time trying to analyze a bit humanitarian principles, principled actions up against the counterterrorism legislation, and really to understand what are the role of us as humanitarian actors in being able to respond on the ground with all these legal, but also reputational and other consequences that the war on terror in its broader sense poses to us. So I would also say that I spent quite a lot of my time on at least relating to CTL related topics every week.
Thank you. Trygve.
Yes, good morning. And sorry I can't be there in person with all of you, but thanks for making it possible to participate online. So I'm a humanitarian affairs and advocacy advisor with MSF Norway, and over the last, I think, 8 years, I've done 9 long and short field assignments with MSF. Maybe the contexts that are most relevant today would be Yemen and also some of the Sahelian countries. But obviously this is it's a very important topic also for MSF that we use a lot of time on internally, both for internal analysis and our operations, and also related to our advocacy. I have to maybe say that I feel I cannot speak from the perspective of Norwegian humanitarian action necessarily, because as I think you know, the Norwegian branch of MSF is not an operational one, and we do not at the moment take funding from the Norwegian government. That may be a point that we can come back to later. Around 95% of MSF's funding comes from private donors, as I think you know. Yeah, so that's a little introduction and a little disclaimer, maybe, and then.
Thank you. Excellent.
Back to Oslo.
Okay, Carl.
Well, yeah, thank you. I'm from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as you said. I work in the humanitarian section, and one of the things I do there is to work on the issue we deal with here. That's necessary exceptions from sanctions. I came from Kabul this summer. I worked there for quite some time in the Norwegian embassy there. And before that, I worked on counterterrorism and fighting pirates, well, spent some years of my life fighting Daesh and so on. So I dealt a little bit with terrorists. Thank you.
Wonderful. And just I forgot to properly welcome the audience, including from embassies, from organizations, from research. We're a diverse audience that trickled in here. We also have an online audience, and the session is recorded. For some food is delayed, some scones and so on is a bit delayed, but when it arrives, you would be most welcome to help yourselves during the discussion. As I mentioned, organizations like the Norwegian Refugee Council would have been also obvious around this table. As we heard yesterday, they've had an important role in these discussions, also around Middle East and so on. Norwegian Church Aids and many others could also be mentioned. What we'll do now is to have a little short presentation from each of the panelists. They've been invited not to give the full picture, but just to introduce the discussion as it looks from their perspective. And afterwards, I'll try to facilitate a discussion amongst the panel, but also inviting input from the audience. Okay, so we'll start with you, Trude, again.
Okay,
Please.
thank you. Yeah, because I think what I would like to talk about is more the unintended consequences of the war on terror, less than the kind of the operational environment that we are seeing on the ground. I presume others will talk more about that. But what we've been more concerned with over the last couple of years is actually everything which is happening around it, and which has as a consequence that the space is narrowing, as we see it, for all humanitarian actors and also civil society actors, which was not the intention. It was also stated as not being the intention. And some of you might be aware of the USAID case that NPA faced a few years back, where we had signed a clause in the humanitarian program in South Sudan, signing up to not providing material support to terrorism, which we do not do. But this was picked up by Zionist Center in California, David Abrahams, who was then bringing this forward as to the Office of Inspector General in the USAID, ended up with us paying $2 million in a settlement, because the risk was actually, what was at stake was $90 million, which then would have made NPA bankrupt. All this was based on photographies from sessions in the Gaza and the West Bank, where youth organizations we were supporting had workshops where also representatives from Hamas had been invited to be challenged by the same youth people. So this, I think the example is good because it kind of says how how easy this regime of counterterrorism measures can be misused, and it is systematically being misused. We're going to mention now a few times the 6 Palestinian organizations recently being designated, but this is a part of a campaign which has gone over several years to use the anti-terror kind of legislation for political purposes. And we see that several places. And we also see that authoritarian regimes are doing the same thing with the national legislation against anti-terror to crack down on their own civil society, but also to crack down on actors, humanitarian actors that they would see would support humanitarian assistance in Northeast Syria, which is seen by Turkey as being terrorist in their kind of worldview. And this is kind of a picture that spreads. So this, and for NPA being being charged made us end up on the world checklist, which is then a private checklist managed by I don't know whom, which is then sold to the banks so that the banks can check who is actually supporting terrorism, ending up with NPA not being able to open a bank account in Samoa Islands, which is quite far from both South Sudan and Palestine. So this also kind of shows the whole how much unintended consequences you would have from one particular case, which then brings me back to the bank de-risking, which in itself is a field which we see is imposing increasing challenges for us because we don't get the money through. I mean, already with the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, the banks are now so afraid to take risks. They are afraid to transfer money to high-risk areas, and because also it has been pointed to the non-profit organizations as being vulnerable to be misused or used for terror financing, they are reluctant to have us as customers. So and then they kind of narrow it down. It's not all non-profit organizations. It is those who are transferring money from one place to another, and particularly those transferring those money to a high-risk area where which then would be subject to sanctions or counterterrorism, which is actually us. So now the FATF have this process to identify the unintended consequences and do something about it. The problem is that these banks all over the world have already taken their measures. So even if you have a good dialogue with your Norwegian bank, that's not enough, because your Norwegian bank has a correspondent bank, and your recipient bank, with whom you also might have a good relationship with, also have a correspondent bank, and you don't have control in that chain. So in 2020, we had 20 transfers that were stopped and sent back to this, and that was humanitarian transfers to high-risk areas. I think it's even more in 2021. And we also had the Bank of New York coming back to our Norwegian bank and say, this organization, Norwegian people say, keep transferring money to Syria. So what is this? We don't want to take that risk. You cannot allow Norwegian people's aid to transfer dollars to Syria. So we had a stop in dollar transfers for several months because of the Bank of New York. And in spite of doing everything that we should do on the ground, knowing all the sanctions, making all the due diligence, screening all the vendors, doing everything, following all the kind of what is demanded from the donors. But as long as the banks do not have sufficient confidence in you doing this in a proper way, still you face the challenges. And I think, and I fear, that we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think that we might have lost control. So I shouldn't be that pessimistic, but I mean, as things has developed since 2015, 2016, it has become increasingly challenging. And I think all organizations are facing the same thing. Certain areas you hardly get money through anymore.
Wonderful. Thanks. I expect there to be clear overlaps with the other organizations. And even if there was a full overlap for identical introductions now, that would also be quite interesting. It would mean that it looks the same for you all. So that is no problem if you repeat some of what has already been said. But Ida.
Thank you. I will put forth three main reflections on this issue, and we may come back to some of them in the conversation that follows this panel. The first is related to the concept of terrorism and the power of definitions. There is no doubt that it's legitimate and necessary to act to ensure the security of states and the security of their population. Acts of terrorism negate the basic principle of humanity and are in many instances contrary to IHL. As a humanitarian organization, we do, however, see that in the efforts to confront terrorism threats, such as measures related to counter-terror, there is a worrying trend towards considering terrorism to be exceptional and thus requiring an exceptional response. We are particularly worried about dehumanization of adversaries and rhetoric indicating that actors designated as terrorists are undeserving of the protection of international law, including IHL. This is an alarming trend. We see this rhetoric also being applied to people associated with designated terrorist organizations, most recently in the case of Northeast Syria. The notion that women, children, and family members with ISIS affiliation are undeserving of humanitarian assistance and humane treatment negates the very cornerstone of IHL. Secondly, I would like to argue that counterterrorism measures affect us because it challenges the very notion of principled humanitarian assistance, because it can hinder or prevent access to areas controlled by non-state armed groups, because it can hinder or delay financial transactions or procurements. In our view, states need to ensure much more effectively that counterterrorism measures and sanctions do not have unintended consequences on humanitarian action. After all, they created the norms that underpin humanitarian action, impartial humanitarian action. They should ensure the subsequent measures to counter terrorism do not hinder the effectiveness of humanitarian action. Clear and robust humanitarian exemptions are needed for this. The last point I would like to make is perhaps mostly a reflection on our humanitarians' own competence and understanding. The complex, technical, and often overlapping nature of counterterrorism measures and sanctions and the consequences they generate. Working to mitigate aid diversion has always been important, but counterterrorism measures add a layer of complexity to humanitarian assistance, often referred to as a chilling effect. We need a thorough understanding of our risk, perceived or real, as well as practical procedures and processes to reduce that risk. I think that speaking from a Norwegian Red Cross context in this regard is particular, because we have relatively flexible donors that are not opposed to accepting risk. But Norwegian Red Cross is part of a larger international Red Cross Red Crescent movement, where we must relate to our partners, the context that they operate in, and the realities that they face. Translated to the operational realm, counterterrorism measures generate risks and challenges to humanitarian organizations that can be difficult, costly, and very time-consuming to mitigate. This is an intricate and very difficult landscape, and understanding it fully requires specialization and resources which have various implications at a time of rising humanitarian needs and shrinking budgets. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so Linda.
Yes, so I think I'm going to take this from a slightly more practical perspective. I want to share some examples of what this actually leads to, in our programs. Although the framing I very much recognize both in what Trude said and Ida. So I just came straight out from Lebanon last night, and just one example there is my organization. It's a big movement. There's a lot of focus on compliance, as I said initially, and the risk appetite tends to be quite moderate, right? In terms of a compliance perspective. What does that lead to on the ground? So what would a country director in Lebanon try to balance out? If you look at the localization agenda and the fact that the Lebanese government centrally is not working, where do we need to work? We need to work at the municipality level, And what happens then when Hezbollah is controlling the area? Well, we are told not to engage. So we're actually, as a consequence of CTL and risk appetite, right now really trying to push the boundary of whether we can be there or not. That's a problem. That's a challenge, and that's something we need to work on. Palestine. What does the recent designation of the 6th Palestinian organization mean for children on the ground? I think there's especially 2 areas where we are very concerned. One is the fact that Defence for Children International is the one doing the verification of the MRM, the grave violations, verifying, for instance, attacks on school, including use of tear gas in schoolyards, detention of children. This organization is no longer going to be able to validate and verify these data. We will not get the same kind of information from the ground. And what about these children in detention? Defence for Children International is also the organization that facilitates that lawyers come in, ensures that the children are doing as good as they can in very challenging circumstances. These children are held in military detention in Israeli system. With Israeli lawyers no longer being able to come in, and Palestinian lawyers also being denied access through checkpoints, and also not necessarily having the right expertise, puts these children in a very difficult and vulnerable situation, violating their basic right to a fair trial system and follow-up. So that's the example from Palestine. Also want to echo what Ida said in Syria, the dehumanization of children, not only in Al-Hol camp and in Al-Roj, but also, when Baghouz fell, many young boys, some as young as 8 to 10 years old, were actually taken to detention centers without any parents. So these are young boys now, for more than 2 years, living in extreme hard conditions in detention centers, with lack of daylight. Some only see 1 hour of daylight in 2 weeks. There's no proper sanitary facilities. They don't have any contact with anyone from the outside, and they have, worst of all, no legal representation or no legal process. What these young boys are facing is a risk of being transferred to adult prison at the age of 18. That's completely unacceptable, and as Ida also says, in really violating basic human international law. Lastly, I also want to point to my experiences working on Yemen. I think that's been one of the really tougher situations to be in for many of us, knowing the situation in the country, having access to funding, to contracts, and from one day to another, when US suspended its programming to the north, 60 to 70% of all the programs in Save the Children was put on hold. Many of these were life-saving interventions at health facilities. It was food distribution. When World Food Programme later that year also suspended their programs because of the humanitarian principle, the action was not easy to deliver either. Again, it's the population that suffers. It's the children and their families that bear the brunt of these effects. So I think, from my perspective, it's really important that we maintain the focus of what does this mean for the communities that we work with, for the ones that we're there to serve, and also tell their stories. Because, it's important to talk about restrictions, compliance, risk, all the technicalities around, but the unintended effects, as also through the points that go so much broader, both in terms of civil society's ability to exist, but also us as humanitarians being able and also willing to take the risk, to deliver principled humanitarian aid. So I think that's what I wanted to say so far. Thank you.
Wonderful. Trygve.
Yep, thank you. So my starting point is also maybe more operational. How we've over the last 2 decades have seen a proliferation of domestic and international legislation, measures and military intervention in the name of counterterrorism, how that has impacted both on the capacity of humanitarians to provide aid, and also, because let's not focus only on ourselves, on the capacity of populations to reach and receive assistance, including for us, of course, important medical care. I think that for us, the challenges that we see can be separated into three main areas. We have the individual level, and this is important and I think often overlooked and something that I'd like to come back to. It's the risk to our individual staff on the ground. Then we have the more operational level, where we have seen attacks on medical structures, armed intrusions into our structures based on suspicions of support, in quotation mark, to terrorists. And these are obviously challenges to our neutrality and operational principles. Then also on the operational level, I feel teams face difficulty in carrying out negotiations, either because armed groups do not want to engage with us, or because of obstacles imposed by authorities. Then also, of course, on the operational level, legal administrative blockages, that has already been covered, I think, by Trude on the banking side, but also in obtaining visas or importation, transportations of goods, medicines, and so on. So then the third level would be the institutional level, where there is also a risk of criminalization of the organization. But I'd like to go back to the first level and the more individual level. As I said, I think it's often overlooked. MSF, we recently published a report on the experience of our frontline workers in counterterrorism environments. Part of that research was in-depth interviews with locally hired MSFers in Iraq, Afghanistan and Nigeria, from ambulance drivers to hospital managers. And 17 out of the 26 interviewees said that they had been subject to violence and intimidation as a direct result of providing treatment to patients considered to be terrorists. And nearly half of them referred to how they fear reprisals if they speak out on what they witness. They also reported frequent attempted or actual arrests of patients suspected to be terrorists inside our health facilities. So if we look at what we have witnessed on the ground, I think over the last years we've seen an evolution in the types of attacks on the medical mission. We witnessed a shift from massive bombings, such as the attack on our hospital in Kunduz, hospitals in Yemen, in Syria. A shift from that to more violence, harassment, intimidation by state and non-state actors. And these are less visible internationally, but they do still threaten the security of our personnel and the respect of the medical mission and of our patients. And this is the very practical side of the fact that Ida mentioned, that counterterrorism legislation is undermining IHL, undermining the IHL framework. But I think it also shows that what is said and done at the policy level can embolden armed actors on the ground, both to prevent wounded and sick from reaching care, and it can also generate hostility towards humanitarian staff. So what is done on the policy level does set the tone for how soldiers act on the ground. So this is how being impartial comes under attack in very, very real ways. What the interviewees to that report said is that the principle of impartiality becomes both more important and harder to imply in the context where they work. So yeah, very depressing, I think, conclusion, but as long as medical care is perceived to be illegitimate, then patients, medical activities and staff remain at risk, and they will be continued to be attacked and threatened and criminalized. So back to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Carl.
Well, yes. Well, thank you for inviting the Minister of Foreign Affairs to this roundtable. And I think that my business is slightly different from the others at this panel, so I hope that can be enlightening. And secondly, I should say that we have moved forward in our endeavor to combat terrorism since a former American president coined the term war on terror. And I say this since you have used the term in the invitation, and I've heard it several times this morning, but I don't think you will hear anyone from my side of the table using such a term, and that's because we do things slightly different now than what we did, or others did, I would say, some time ago. But terrorism is a problem, and we will continue to combat it as long as it persists as a problem. Be sure of that. I should say that Norway does not have a list on terrorist organizations or terrorists, and neither does Norway associate itself with any lists of this kind made by others. And the exception to this is decisions by the United Nations Security Council, of which Norway currently is a member. And the point here, of course, is that when the Security Council makes a decision of any kind, then it's binding for every member of the United Nations, regardless of who they are, everyone. So you can't escape that. Norway is now, of course, as a member of the Security Council, in a position to influence decisions made there. And we think that is a good thing. But then, of course, so that there are many members there, and 5 of them are permanent members, and they have the right of veto. So they have slightly more influence than Norway. We fully realize how important it is to make exceptions for humanitarian assistance in cases where the United Nations sanctions make it complicated to bring sanctions into countries where people are in humanitarian crisis, as we've heard several examples on today. And Norway does work actively in order to make such exceptions. But having said that, we also realize what we've heard this morning, that private sector, and a good example, we heard about that today, banks, they make their own decisions. And of course, they also might impede humanitarian aid to reach its destination. So sometimes you should address your questions to those in the private sector and not necessarily to governments, because everyone should then, of course, stand up for their own decisions and answer for them. I should add that the Financial Action Task Force under the OECD is another place where Norway is inactive in order to make exceptions to sanctions. And the task force task, as you perhaps know, is to prevent the laundering of terrorists and other criminals' money. And believe me, laundering of money by terrorist organizations and organized crime is a problem. It's a huge problem. But I would say that Norway also have had success over the last years, especially in the Security Council, in achieving exceptions of the kind we discussed here today. And I think that Mali and the Democratic Republic of Congo are good cases. Right now, Afghanistan, where I worked until a few months ago, is the most important case. And as you know, several de facto ministers and also a high ranking in the Red Crescent and other leading figures are listed by the relevant sanctions committee and the Security Council. And that makes things difficult. Believe me, some of these men are very, very rich men, and they made much of the money from drugs trade. There are no saints. There's a good chance that if they can get hand on some of the money that we talk about here, they'll take it. So we have to be careful. But we are also working on the case of Afghanistan because it's so important to make sure that humanitarian aid can be brought to people there. But the state of work in the Security Council right now is so that I will not predict the outcome of what is done there. So I will not enlighten you on that. Norway does, however, want a workable exception clause. That's what I will say so far. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. We've heard now a rich scope of different aspects of this, and of course we're covering a broad territory. The topic of the session is very broad, and I think you helped us kind of showing that it's a multifaceted field, and I'm happy that you also sort of represented both sides of it with MFA's kind of also balancing between actual concerns relating to this to terrorism and responses there, and on the other hand how this affects the organizations. Of course, we talked about then sanctions and blacklisting from that are unilateral from states. We talked about the UN, and then there are situations where which has already been always been a challenge for organizations to operate when the host government tries to regulate where the organizations can go and how they can program their work. And there's a sort of an aspect of that also here. For instance, when you think of current situation in Ethiopia and how humanitarian organizations are maneuvering there at present. You mentioned Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria. Those are obviously some of the places where this really plays out at present. And we discussed Afghanistan at some length yesterday, where this really is the crux of the matter at present. I'd like to open for some first reactions within the panel to what your colleagues said, and then I'll open for questions or comments from the audience afterwards. So do you have any immediate reactions to what the others commented on? Then just raise your hands. And also I'll follow the chat if there are people online with comments or questions. Ida.
I think it's, first of all, really interesting to gather us all together and hear about the collective kind of experiences and reflections on this issue. I mean, my first reaction is that when we're speaking about this, I mean, intellectually and also practically, the impact is kind of like, we're talking about two different things, because the first is the impact on the rhetoric that has grown out of the war on terror, the rhetoric and what it has created in terms of enemy pictures and dehumanization. And I think Trygve also mentioned this new report by MSF, which really spotlights these challenges very well for humanitarian workers in the field, creating like security issues because of their ability to carry out impartial humanitarian action. And the second is more the impact of the measures imposed as a result of the war on terror. And these are more practical, financial issues that we need to solve, or that we spend a lot of time kind of trying to mitigate in our daily work, spending time, resources, and capacity to overcome these like practical hurdles. So I'm just saying this because I feel like these are two separate issues that we need to tackle at a kind of language and advocacy level, and also on a practical level.
Right. Trude.
Yeah, no, I think we all recognize the kind of the operational challenges that has been described by my colleagues here. I think this is the kind of the reality that we are all meeting. We see also in that operational environment the lack of kind of definition somehow. I mean, who is actually a terrorist, and what is actually material support? Because both, I mean, this ambiguity in this regard makes things extremely difficult. I mean, like it's been mentioned already, I mean, the family members of people who have been fighting with a designated terror organization, for instance, are they terrorists? I mean, or are they entitled to humanitarian aid? And the interesting thing is that that's being discussed at the donors' tables as well. So we have that kind of dialogue with the donors. I mean, because we think, yes, of course, they are entitled to humanitarian aid. They're also entitled to participate in whatever rehabilitation services we could offer. But we need to have that dialogue to ensure that we have a common understanding of that. And these donors need to go back to the legal departments and the compliance departments. And there's different people further away from the reality on the ground. And what the interesting thing is that the people we talk with, they are kind of a bit afraid of these compliance people and legal people because they are quite square-minded. And everybody here are trying to save their own back. And that, I think, is a major problem. And we appreciate very much kind of the flexible attitude of Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that you don't have the terrorist list. I think that's a very good thing. But on the other hand, we saw that when it was a takeover in northern Syria some years back by ISIS of a hospital that was run by Norwag, it became a debate in the Norwegian parliament, which then had repercussions. And I think it ended up with Norwag pulling out of that particular hospital. Not because, I mean, it's so much politics into this. And so it is extremely difficult for us to maneuver, I think, because we are at the kind of, we are the end, not the end recipients, we are between the recipients and all those decision makers and actors out there, and we do not have control. Not of the political discourse, not of the banking system, all these private actors. The donors, yes, we have a dialogue, we can kind of partly influence that, I would say, with good dialogue, but it's so much of this we cannot influence. And it is very, very limited understanding, I think, in the public discourse, and that's also why I kind of appreciate this seminar, because I think it's very, very rarely discussed.
Linda, I see your hand.
Yeah, no, lots of things to potentially pick up on, but just to your last point there, through that, because what we're really talking about, and we started this already at the Syria onset, what about risk and risk transfer? And I think, again, as much as we've appreciated Norway's flexibility, we've also had a lot of conversations with the ministry and other donors about risk and how we manage risk. And there is still a feeling, although I think we've, come to a practice where we alert, we highlight, we flag incidents, we put a lot on that mutual trust in communication, which in the daily, handling of awards and being sort of compliant, but also frank and transparent about the operating environment. It has worked well, but again, it also affects how we transfer risks again to our partners on the ground. The feeling of just pushing it further and leaving them there, like in when things changed inside Syria, and our partners need to drop everything they have. We have to close offices. What then happens to them? We try to have good systems in place of making sure that we take care of them, that we protect them to the extent possible. But we can protect them against future retaliations from the government, where they take control of areas where they used to live and work. We cannot control what's going to happen to their children and their opportunities to enroll in school and have a decent life. So I think it's very important that we continue to have the conversations about transfer risk and duty of care. In addition to that, maybe a bit more, let's talk even more and continue the conversation about what do we mean by CTL, because we had a lot of discussions 5-6 years ago, but now I feel like we're into this kind of, we have a system in place, we do it this way, and that's how it's dealt with, and it's sort of ticked, but it's not. It's a living target or a living topic. And again, thank you so much for having this seminar, because I think this is the kind of for us that we have.
Excellent. I thought that summed up several of the aspects also that I noted for further discussion, like how this affects your risk thinking in general and the programming in general. I also just wanted to, we now say war on terror. You noted, Carl, that this is not necessarily the term which is generally used, and yes, I guess we here use it as a shorthand for an extremely complex set of phenomena. but there's still the discussion shows that there are common threads across these very different also arenas of operations where the legislations affect operations. Yes, Carl.
Could I just say a few words about that? Because those words were very visible for me when I saw the kind of invitation. I remember that when Obama became president, I think on his first day, he used the term "our endeavor to counter terrorism." And that's where I've been since. And of course, in politics and in diplomacy, things change, and this has changed. So I don't like war on terrorism very much, and I would suggest that you don't use it. I think Obama, you formulated that much better.
Yeah. Any comments or questions from the audience? Yes, we have one from the chat, and then let's start with the online participants. Yeah, please read it.
Okay, so this is a question from the online audience. It's not directed to anyone in particular, but they ask, what is the experience and challenges for humanitarian organisations when negotiating with the policymakers in foreign affairs and home affairs departments? Can the humanitarian organisations influence or persuade the government agencies so that you can have humanitarian access, travel, visas, etc.? Or is it just to follow the counter-terrorism laws?
Good question. I'll take Gilar also, please.
Can I speak from here?
You'll actually have to come up here because of the microphone. So, yes.
Thank
please.
you. I'm Emmanuel Aguilard from the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. I spoke yesterday, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences, all very familiar. I want to take advantage of the presence of a representative of the Norwegian MFA, and it was interesting, you said the other side of the table. I have to say, I've worked on this file across contexts, and I would say that Norway is definitely not the difficult other side of the table when it comes to these issues, and particularly in its role as a donor. But I wanted to take advantage of your presence here, and I don't know to what extent you can answer these questions. I'd be curious to hear about some aspects of your experience in New York, understanding what the dynamics are. And I think there needs to be a bit of a quid pro quo when we're discussing safeguards and exceptions. Yes, humanitarians are in need of these. And I like you, I feel we've reached a turning point and there's a willingness of the Council to engage more. But also, I think it's fair, if we ask for exceptions for safeguards, I think it's fair to say, and this is how we've used them. So I'd be curious a bit to hear where the quid pro quo on that front is. And then I also feel that there's a moment of opportunity for a forward-leaning state to do more at domestic level. And what do I mean by this? Express exceptions are few. At present, we only have one in relation to Somalia. I wonder whether that will be different by the close of day today. Hopefully, it might be different. But you also hear the Council saying, states, when you give effect to these sanctions at domestic level, they must not, they need to comply with IHL, with international law, which to me is an opening of a door to a bold state who's not an EU member to actually say, you know what, I think that's an indication that there is an implicit exception for humanitarian action. And when I adopt domestic law measures to give effect to these Security Council sanctions, I am going to include an exception for humanitarian action. So I actually think there's an opportunity for a bold member state to do this. Switzerland, Norway. And then finally, my last point relates to the banking dimension. You are right, it is banks that have a different risk appetite. How does this tie in with the sanctions? I think that I agree that the inclusion of a sanction isn't the solution automatically, but its absence does give a message to banks. So this is how I would look at the interplay. If it's there, it might not be the solution. If it's not there, it makes banks all the more resistant. And then moving to banks, what I have seen is that domestic states do have a role to play. At least in the first step, in engaging with their own banks at domestic level. And as you've said, it's a chain, so that only gets you so far. But there have been 2 states that I'm aware of, the Netherlands and the UK, that have set up domestic tripartite conversations. The different parts of states, MFA, Treasury, Home Affairs, banks and the NGO sector. And this has been very helpful in building trust and trying to find a way of introducing these 2 very different actors to each other. And the state plays a role in reassuring them. And I'm wondering to what extent it might not also be possible to create that kind of conversation in Norway. And these are not accusations. As I say, Norway is a very pleasant state to engage with on this topic.
Thank you. So those 2 questions and comments were very complimentary. So I'll just open up for thoughts from the panel. Yes.
I think that some of this was directed towards me. And firstly, I can only answer from Norway. I mean, if you want to discuss what other countries do, I mean, you actually have to discuss it with them. And as I said, that since Norway does not have any designations for terrorist organization, terrorism, and so on, I think that we are an easy partner in the way that we do not have a plethora of national sanctions. What we do is, of course, to do what we're doing under the Security Council. And there are some other kinds of sanctions. For example, you're aware that there are some slight problems in countries like Belarus and so on. And so in that case, since Norway is not one of the really big players internationally. What Norway normally does in such a case is to join EU sanctions. But I don't think we talk about Belarus here right now. We are, of course, and I also say that banks, of course, yes, they are very concerned about the risk they run as companies. But then again, and we want to make exceptions so that they can take that risk. But we cannot influence business decisions by the private sector either, because I mean we are not the owners of those banks. This might be a problem, but that's how it is. But we, as I said, we work hard not only in the United Nations but also in the Financial Action Task Force to see how not only we but all the relevant countries together can make the right decisions. And believe me, this is quite complex. I'm trying to learn this now since August, and I still haven't understood all of it because there are people who have done this for 10 years who find it complicated to understand the banking sector, for example. About the mechanics in New York, well, it's so that there is always what they call a pen holder, which is the country who's
dynamics, not mechanics.
Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, sure. Dynamics sounds better, but it's not so different, I think. The point here is that the way the things are done then is that you have a pen holder who then make a draft. And so that country normally tries to find out what the 5 permanent members think about an issue, because to do something on which, for example, China and the United States should disagree simply is difficult. Now, in this case, Afghanistan, the United States is the pen holder. So what we do, of course, is what diplomats very often do. We try to find out what other countries want to do about this, and then, of course, we try to come up with solutions, discuss how things can be done, so that we can take part in the brewing process before you have a product. That's all I can say about this. This is called diplomacy. But exactly how this now will unfold and what the result will be is something that I can not say anything more about. And of course, well, I don't know the end result. But that's a little bit about the dynamics.
Ida.
Just in relation to the question from the chat on experience with the negotiations, I think it was, yeah. I just wanted to first mention that I said it in my opening statement, but speaking from the Norwegian Red Cross perspective is perhaps a bit isolated because we are working with relatively flexible donor, but I am also, bringing experiences from the Red Crescent movement, which includes the International Federation of the Red Cross and also the ICRC. And I mean, there are a number of examples of activities, humanitarian activities that have been affected by these kind of measures, including, detention visits, including ability to reach areas controlled by non-state actors, war surgery seminars, training on international humanitarian law, etc. And we also have experiences with more like practical, ability to transfer funds. For instance, in Lebanon, after the Beirut explosion, there were well, not related to transfer of funds, but directions on how the funds could be spent. We were not able to spend funds on, for instance, cash programming, even though that at the time was assessed as the most efficient modality because of measures against Hezbollah. In terms of negotiations and experiences with kind of trying to mitigate these measures, I would say that once again, two levels in terms of, humanitarian diplomacy and language. From my kind of sources within the Red Cross movement, the language included in this Security Council Resolution 2462 from 2019, which specifically says that urging states to take into account the potential effects of such measures. My sources say that this has made a difference, but there are still a lot of practical issues related to negotiations. For instance, in contracts, requiring, for instance, a screening of beneficiaries. Negotiations on language in contracts, for instance, not using broad language such as support to or association with, but rather switching the burden to, for instance, this is intended only for humanitarian purposes. That can be kind of a way. But back to my one of my main points in my opening statement, it's possible, but it takes so much time and resources and capacity that should be used for other endeavors.
Thanks. Trygve?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to follow up a bit on Emanuela's question and also the latest comment by Carl, if that's okay. I was interested if it's possible for you, Carl, to say something more about what Norway defines as a workable exemption. What do you mean by workable? Emanuela mentioned what is in the Somalia sanctions regime, but as far as I know, if you look at the text itself, that would not include actors such as MSF, for example. I think de facto it has been taken to include also MSF, but I'm not sure if what is in the Somalia sanctions regime is the ideal. So it would be very interesting to hear from Norway's perspective, what is an ideal exemption and what is a workable one? Is there a difference there? Ida mentioned if there's an ad hoc exemption only, that would require a lot of work by the NGOs. That's very different from a standing exemption, for example. So yeah, it would be interesting to hear a bit more about how you define workable. And if Emanuela could comment as well, that would be very interesting, of course.
Now I both have Trude and Linda, and I also have two hands from the audience, and we're having less than 10 minutes left. So I'll ask you to be brief, Trude and Linda, and then see if we get time.
Okay, yeah, there were several points here, but just I think one thing that we need to do in regard to the question on the dialogue with the governments extremely challenging for smaller organizations. I mean, if you are a huge one, if you are the Red Cross or if you are even Save the Children, you would have that presence in all these countries. I mean, an organization like NPA is a Norwegian organization. What we can do is actually negotiate on the contracts and have that kind of dialogue. So it's limited to what extent we can influence anyone else than the Norwegian government. But one key area that we are discussing and where we get nowhere is actually shared risk, because all the donors would be pushing the responsibility for the risks we are taking to us as implementers. I think that is a dialogue that we need to, I would challenge also the ministry, because we have the same discussions with MFA, working in high risk areas where our presence is wanted. I think we need actually to discuss sharing of risks. And then I would very much support what Manuela also brought forward on the need for a domestic tripartite conversation, where we also bring in the private sector, because without having the private sector as part of this dialogue, they should actually have been here, because they're also practitioners, to have them as part of this dialogue, and they need also to build up their competence. And finally, from my side, on humanitarian exceptions, should be a bit careful, because I mean, I would also like an exception for support to civil society and democratization, for instance. So if you only target humanitarian action and say, I bet they are kind of the nice guys, so let's make exceptions for them, all the other work that we are doing will do that. So I think that is also a discussion to be continued, I think.
Linda, please.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. I wanted to just comment on the question, can the humanitarian organizations influence, and refer to the process in Yemen just as another concrete example, because definitely one thing is what we can do as Norwegian organizations from here, but many of us form part of global movements and also work, of course, with other NGOs present on the ground. I mean, when we saw the suspension of aid from the US and eventually the terrorist designation, of course, there's been a process also with the local authorities, both in the north, the de facto, and the actual government in the south, for hindering humanitarian access. We struggled to get people into the country, we struggled to get approvals. And the deeper we go into the crisis, the longer the approvals take. I mean, to get a project approved in Yemen now take from 6 to 9 months. Makes it almost impossible to deliver unless you plan with a really long horizon. Now, you know, I just wanted to point out the fact that, yes, there is an ongoing benchmark process, but the fact that the donors have been so much involved in this, also trying to push for, you know, yes, we will make sure that humanitarian aid can come in. Yes, you know, the designation was taken back, you know, but it has to be concrete examples of how access is improved also from the local side. And this is where Norway and other donors really play a great role. The fact that Norway just went on a mission to Yemen a month ago or so was seen as, you know, another good example of donors being in country again, really visible, to also ensure that that side is handled when it comes to humanitarian access.
Thanks. Okay, so we have two hands here. So Jon Karlsrud first, and then from the Embassy of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Should I come closer to the microphone?
Just here, like Emanuela.
So yeah, my question. My name is Jon Karlsrud. I'm with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. My question, or kind of comment that I would like to hear your views on, is that humanitarian action and counterterrorism is increasingly bound to the hip. It's in a kind of an uncomfortable marriage, because what has structurally happened over the last 10 years is that Western countries have kind of limited their ambitions. They have withdrawn from the kind of large-scale peace-building and state-building projects. And Obama was the key architect, in a way, who stopped the state-building programs and really boosted counterterrorism action operations in the US. And the whole kind of strategic center of action in Pentagon moved from state-building to counterterrorism in 2010-11. Norway has followed suit, and so has all other Western countries. So then what we see on the ground is that there's more limited funding to kind of peace building and state building, and increase in funding to humanitarian action. And counterterrorism actions. So this is kind of bound to just continue, I think, unfortunately, this uneasy combination of at least Western countries' engagements in these conflict-affected areas. So, views and comments.
Absolutely. Thanks. Please.
Thank you. My name is Zahir Mohammed. I'm from Afghanistan Embassy. It's personal. No one can thank you more than me, because I'm having a personal experience. I have been an IDP. I have lived in the camp, and it was the humanitarian organization that helped me go to school and got a scholarship and done my bachelor and done my master degree. And thank you so much. I mean, your job is not just a job. Because I've got personal experience, I always look the clips and what Jon England did in Yemen. There was I don't know what it was blanket or a bag of something, food or something. The way he was, his personnel was giving to the Yemeni people, and the feeling they had, I mean, the happiness. It is really difficult for you guys because you've never been to the camp. You're on this side of the table, but you just read, and it is me, I understand how they feel. How they feel when their mother is sick and they're waiting for a doctor and you guys go and help them. Thank you so much. Thank you. And my question is that what would be the response of this international humanitarian organization if their efforts been politicized? For example, Boko Haram is asking that, okay, I would release these girls, but if you do this in other part of the country, or the Taliban is asking, give you access if you give us recognition. What would have been your response? Thank you very much. Again, thank you.
We're very short of time, but I'll open for a last reaction. Carl?
I think I can be short.
Yeah.
Firstly, to the last question, Norway does not negotiate with terrorists. Full stop. Secondly, it was Trygve who would like to know what Norway defines as a workable solution. And I would say that that I cannot and will not define because it's not possible. And the reason, of course, is that every sanctions regime is different, and they are complicated both to make and to understand and to tangible when you have to do that. But as the British say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So that what we do want, of course, is humanitarian assistance to reach its destination without being plundered by, for example, Taliban members. Thank you.
Yes, we're unfortunately out of time. I think this was a wonderfully rich discussion. Is there something I didn't see? No. I don't have time to. I would have wanted to give you a last word, but this discussion will have to continue both into this break and then into the coming years. And I'm hoping that we can also continue to facilitate some of these discussions within Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, but also make sure to continue it internationally and within Norway, independent of that. Thanks so much to excellent contributions from the panel. And now we'll have a little break. The scones have apparently arrived, and we'll soon go into the next section with some cases of how this plays out in other places, the Sahel region, Somalia, and Yemen. So please stay with us. Thank you so much.